Hi, everyone. I think Jason hit a little bit of this in the bio, but a little bit of a background information. I work for a company called Healthland. Healthland makes healthcare information systems that track things like the clinical data for medical visits, the financials for hospitals, that sort of thing. Focused very much towards the small rural hospitals that have 50 beds or less. It's a .NET backend. It's HTML, CSS, and JavaScript up front. We try very hard to keep it using as minimal things as we can so that it runs on things like the iPads that doctors really, really seem to be loving these days. And that's kind of our app. I've been doing this for about 16 years. Started using Selenium back in 2007. And what I'm going to talk about today is kind of, I'm going to give a case study of what we're doing with our automation that's going to pull together a lot of the topics that people have helpfully talked about in depth over the course of the conference already. So I'm happy that they had that sort of thing. Now, when I started, and I've been working at Healthland for about 6 months now, there was some automation going on there. And in addition to the normal reasons of doing test automation, like getting these tests running on multiple platforms and a lot of those common things, there were some specific things that were causing problems with the existing automation that we were trying to avoid. First of all, we were using a commercial tool. It was only running on Windows. It only worked with Firefox and Internet Explorer. Our app needs to run on a Mac with Safari, on an iPad, on Windows with Firefox, Internet Explorer, Safari, Chrome, as many browsers as we can. So it was a key component that we planned for was that we would bring in all of this cross-platform, cross-browser support. We have internally several environments set up at any given time with different versions of the software. It was taking up to 2 weeks to take the automation that existed and move it over to one of those new environments. And a lot of that was because there was hard-coded data that either didn't exist in the new database, we had to go back and create it, find replacements. There were brittle XPath locators that we had to adapt if the UI had changed between environments. So we wanted to make sure that we were very able to quickly go to a new environment. My goal now, and I haven't actually tried to see if I've met it yet, is 10 minutes to get it up and running in a new environment. When I started, the people doing the automation had about a 900 test case backlog from what the developers were doing. And these weren't necessarily the best test cases for them to be automating, but one of the key pieces is we really wanted to keep up with the developers. They're doing 2-week sprints. We want to be right up there with them as they do their sprints. There was also some vendor lock-in. Brett talked about the commercial tools this morning, and we're in a situation where we had purchased floating licenses for a tool. A couple months after we purchased licenses, they made a new release that got rid of those licenses, which was going to make it a hassle for us to upgrade. And they had built-in limitations on what browsers they would test. So we weren't even able to test with the latest version of Firefox anymore without going through all this upgrades process. And so we really wanted to avoid getting into a situation like that again. We also wanted to avoid the scenario where our test cases started off effective, we found bugs, and then they pretty much never did anything useful for us again other than providing some level of confidence, rightly or wrongly. And finally, we really wanted to make it easy for people to go in and see what were we testing. The test code that was there was very much just programming code. You never would see a business analyst or anybody, even most of the test team, going in and looking at that code to figure out what was going on. So to get that platform browser support, we opted to use Selenium 2. And we're also doing the development from the start. I've run a test on the iPad partly. I've used a Mac, all that, right from the beginning, so I do not get surprised later when I try to do it. For the rapid deployment, the goal, we're structuring things, and I'm going to talk about how this whole thing is architected in a minute, so that we never have to make a change in more than one place. There will be some aggressive refactoring because I don't think we're quite there in what we've got for the code, but every time we do have to make a change in more than one place, we are going to do that refactoring and bring it back down. We're not hard-coding any data in our scripts. The tests do not say, given John Smith, patient who was admitted on March 27th with an allergy to penicillin. They simply just say, when I have a patient with an allergy. And we're using that data then, and that more general specification of the data to go out and pull in data relevant to our environment. And we're doing our locators more robustly so that we don't have things that go all the way back up to the HTML tag in the DOM, which was one of the other big problems we were having. We're keeping up with the developers. We're going to plan our test scenarios as part of our feature planning. And I'm going to put in a brief disclaimer here. This is still fairly new. There's a lot of we're going tos, and this is what we have planned. I have code working for across the entire application, but we haven't built out a whole lot of test cases with it yet. Again, we're minimizing the change locations. Another piece that I'm doing is it's very much focusing as much of the test suite as I can from a business side, ignoring the implementation except for where I absolutely have to. My reasoning for that is that the business aspects of our application are going to be far less likely to change, and if they do change, it's probably going to take a significant effort on the developer's part as well. But it's very easy for a developer to just go in and say, hey, this edit box is now going to be a combo box. And so by keeping layers in our test that abstract away the implementation, we can then keep up with those, keep with only make changes in one place, and really keep that momentum going. The last piece we're using for this, we're actually using a tool called Cucumber. Dima talked about Cucumber yesterday. We're doing this so that the entire test team can write our test scenarios. We can pull in the BAs. Our business analysts are actually very excited about doing this, and which I guess is kind of odd for some places, but I lucked out. And so we're shifting off some of that scenario. And now there's still code that has to go behind every one of those scenarios. That's going to be me and my cohort who is working on this with me. But not everything needs to be written by me. So that'll be a little bit of a bottleneck reduction. For vendor lock-in, we want to do an open source tool. Now, we'd already chosen Selenium 2 somewhat for the browser stuff. That was just a useful thing that came up. And all of the calls to Selenium 2 are pushed down into page objects at the very bottom layer of our test stack, so that if we ever have to switch it out, we can do that. Now, with our script lock-in is when I say script lock-in, what I mean is that most automated tests in general will have effectiveness when you are creating them, but then they follow the same path over and over again. So if this is our application, and we have a few bugs in our application, and we can create some automated tests. These tests will run through, and some of them will find bugs, and some will pass. And we'll fix those bugs, and run our tests again, and now everything's green. Hey, it passed. And we can run them again, and they'll still keep passing. And sometimes developers will add in additional bugs that we'll find, and sometimes we'll add additional tests that find more bugs. But most of them are still running the same path. What we want to do is add a little bit of variance in our tests so that they keep trying new things without going completely off the script. So there's three ways that I'm planning to bring some of that randomness into our tests. The first, I already talked a little bit about using random data. When a test case just says, I need a patient with an allergy, or I want to log in as a doctor, there are some number of records in the database, hopefully at least one, that match that criteria. So rather than always using a certain doctor's login or a certain patient, we go out and in the environment that we're in, find one that matches the criteria. And I've been using a set of builders that can filter down that list from all patients down to one with an allergy, maybe one with an allergy to a medication, or all users down to a doctor, and building that in from the start. And there will be the code, this is one piece I still have to do, to create those in the case where I filter it down too much, and so there's no one. But using the random data is a core underlying principle that we're trying to bring into this automation. And there are two pieces that are kind of on the nice to have later list. I'm not building them right now, but probably it'll be towards the end of the summer, early fall when I do that. And the first one is what I'm calling a behavior manager. Now, if you're trying to say, for example, you want text on your clipboard, and you don't really care how it gets there, you're just going to copy some text to the clipboard for a test. Now, you can select the text and hit Control-C. You can select the text and go up to the Edit menu and select Copy. Maybe you have a button on a toolbar. Maybe you have a right-click context menu. A lot of the times when I've seen automation done, what I've seen is one of those ways gets picked. Maybe it's the way that the automator uses themselves. Maybe it's the one that's easiest to code. Whatever, they pick one, and all the tests use that same method every time they need to copy it. What the behavior manager does is it says, hey, I know these 4 different ways to do it. This time, let's do number 1. And then next time you run the test, maybe it picks number 2. And you can put intelligence in there to make sure that it goes through them sequentially from run to run, or just pick randomly. But unless you're actually testing that copy functionality, and it doesn't matter how that test, if it doesn't matter how it gets up there, then you might as well switch it up and try some of these different methods, things that should work equivalently, but may not in actuality. The other piece, I want to take and bring in some of the concepts of high-volume test automation, where vendors, such as HP, when they're testing their printers, will take their existing tests and just string them together in random order. So we have all these capabilities in our app. Now, there'll be a driver that'll just run and start picking things randomly, filling in the data, and stringing them together over the course of days to see if there are any interactions that we didn't think of and plan for. And if we do find them, then they can come back into our Cucumber scenarios and be run going forward. Now, our last goal was really maintaining the clarity of our tests. The Cucumber tests are defined in plain text so that anybody can go in and read them and see what's going on. Our tests only specify the relevant details. A patient with an allergy rather than John Smith who is allergic to shellfish. That helps keep things focused on the point of the test. I've gone into tests in the past that have said, admit this patient on March 3rd, and it's now November, and our app only allows you to admit people in 10 days back. So was the March 3rd just the last time it was run was in March, and so it was a convenience, or are we testing that it was supposed to be back? And if the test isn't clearly written with that regard, it can be very muddied very quickly. So we're keeping things to only the salient details. Now, one of the pieces in the layers are, there are verifications spread throughout the layers. But the test cases themselves will specifically have those verifications, some verifications as well, to make it clear what the test is looking for. One of the things that I did not like about the tests I worked with at Microsoft was they had these layers, and it was great, and they pushed all the verification down into those layers, and then you had test cases that basically said, click here and do that. And there was no indication of what the test was looking at. It was all handled by those hidden verifications. And again, that made it harder to see what the point of the test was. And my team is convinced they need a test case manager. So we'll probably tie into that eventually once we figure out what we want for that. So to kind of map to some of our manual test cases that have been done in the past. So here's how this is all structured. We've got a set of test cases. Now, the top set of test cases there is labeled Model Office. That's from an internal version of this talk. Our Model Office talks are basically a set of core functional end-to-end tests. We've also got our regular functional tests. And those all go through Cucumber here. That sits on top of a layer of code that is solely focused on the actions that a user is trying to do for the app. That layer, the conceptual layer, has no understanding of the actual controls on the page, the implementation. It does know the page flow, but everything there is focused around what a user is going to do. Maybe it's admit a new patient, create an order, enter lab results for a patient. That layer, oh, and this is all in Ruby code, by the way. That layer sits on top of the implementation layer. That layer has our page objects. It has the wrapping of the control. All of the Selenium calls are in that implementation layer. And then there are a couple of support layers across the top. The support layer has builders, data classes, that sort of thing. The verification layer provides some common verification routines. And all of that goes through Selenium WebDriver using Ruby. At the bottom here is our current test set. And we're keeping those around as well, a little bit of a build verification and as better than nothing type thing. But they'll eventually be phased out and rolled into the main architecture. That all goes just through the Firefox and IE that we were limited to with the first tool. But Selenium will also give us the Safari, the Chrome, and when it becomes a priority for our business, we're just starting to see doctors picking up some of the Android tablets. Opera hasn't really hit the radar of my product managers yet, but as it does, we'll roll those in as well and start testing against them. So the test case layer. These are our Cucumber features. These are created at the moment with me sitting down with a BA as we're kind of just flushing out some example ones. But this will be moved into the full story creation where the developers, the product managers, the business analysts, and the whole test team is pulled in. And even if it still becomes just a handful of the testers actually writing the specific Cucumber features, the discussion and the understanding that comes from those is going to be done across the product. The Cucumber layer itself is very thin, and I'll pull that up in a second. It's pretty much every step definition is simply just a call into the conceptual layer with some logging and that sort of thing around it. And again, we're only specifying the essential pieces of the test at the Cucumber level. This is also the level where that random test driver will go. It'll be doing very similar functionality and calling into that logical layer. So this is an example of one of our Cucumber tests. And it doesn't have any tags, like Dima talked about yesterday. It will. We're figuring out what those tags need to be in our case. But we start off with a feature notification. And in our application, on most screens, if you've got a current patient selected and that patient has an allergy, that's something that a doctor really needs to be aware of. So there's a little tab that shows up on the screen to indicate whether that patient has any allergy information in the system. So this is one scenario. This is a case where we have not specified anything about the patient's allergies. It's initial state. We haven't said they have an allergy. We haven't said they don't have an allergy. We just haven't said anything. The top part of the feature is pretty much, it's for readability. It gets echoed out into the Cucumber log, but Cucumber itself doesn't do much with it other than that. The scenario at the bottom, that's the equivalent of a test case. In this case, we're setting up a precondition. We've got a patient with no allergy information. Then an action, when I go to a page that has that allergy warning, which will actually go in this test, we'll go to any page in our app that has it. It'll go cycle through all of them. Then it should see that the patient has no allergy information on file, which is mapped to look for this tab, which should have this text and this graphic. But that's all handled behind the scenes because this part is less, we're always going to have an allergy notification. This is less likely to change. How that is implemented may, but so that isolates this layer from it. Now the conceptual layer, that takes these calls from the Cucumber features, pulls out whatever data the Cucumber feature has specified, and so it uses that, and then it goes out and it pulls in whatever other data is needed. So if we're talking about a patient, we'll go out, we'll call the builder to either get an existing patient or from the database, get a new patient using fakenamegenerator.com. Perhaps we'll pull allergy information or whatever information is needed that the test didn't specify is grabbed at this layer. This then calls down into the implementation layer, passing down that data and calling into the page objects at the appropriate places to actually drive the test. At the implementation layer, this is where all the interaction with the web page controls are. This is where all of the Selenium calls are. And it's got page objects and what I'm calling control objects, which are pretty much just wrappers around the various controls that we provide. And we're also using some Ruby modules to pull in things like our header, our footer, common elements that are found across our site. And in that page object, we don't have a lot of the Ajax-y dynamic stuff that Dante was talking about in his talk. So we've got a single class that goes to each page of our application. And if you were in Adam's You're Doing It Wrong talk, he talked about having page objects with both elements and actions. My page objects only have actions. They never expose the elements of the page outside of that page object itself, so that everything related to those controls is inside that class. And nothing but that page object knows how to interact with those controls, or even what controls to interact with. Let me show you one of those. All right, so this is backing up a little bit. This is at the conceptual layer. And this is just our login function. It was nice because it fit on a screen even at that font size. And in this case, you can see the Ruby syntax. Basically, this takes any arguments given to login and shoves them all into a hash table. And then after that, right now we're defining a default user ID and default password for our environments. They are defined off in a YAML file. And if user or password is not in that hash table of options, we're putting in the default ones. So at the end of this merge statement, there will be something labeled :user. There will be something labeled :password in that hash table. If something was passed in, it's what it was passed in. If something wasn't, it's the default. And then we just do some logging. And we create an instance of this account login page object and pass in that user ID and password to the logon function. Now that page object looks like this. In the initialize method, which is called as soon as this page is instantiated, we set the URL that we expect for that page to have. And then we say, hey, you should have all these control objects. There should have an edit box that you find with this ID. It's a username. You should have another edit box with an ID of password. Oh, and there should be this hyperlink that's styled to look like a button. Here's the XPath to find it. That's one of the places where I need to talk to my developers and actually get an ID put in for that. And so it's created all these control objects, and it's just sitting there waiting. It hasn't done anything other than kind of done its initialization. But when this logon method is called, ensure_ready is just a method that's built into my base page that it says, am I actually on the URL that I think I'm on? And ready to do this. And then we take the username and password. We provide this value equals is part of the control objects that do send keys or retrieve the value. The Selenium calls, set the username and password, click on that login link, and then return an instance of the next page that we should end up at. Now the control objects, here, again, I have a base control that has a lot of things like click and a lot of things that are very common across the controls. And then each one defines whatever methods are necessary. The value equals, so we're checking for the length. If a text box is set to a maximum length of characters, we check for that here. Because if we go over that max length, we're getting into the realm of browser testing, not our application testing, and handle some of that, and basically end up, when we call this super method, all it's doing is sending keys to the element that Selenium finds. So those control objects, some of them actually don't have any specific functions, like button is one that doesn't. But using some metaprogramming in Ruby, we're pulling that in as well so we can get the name of the class and log it out. This is where there will be verification built in at that point, so that a edit box that we are always wanting to check a certain way, we can build that in right at the start. Each control will make sure that it got set correctly after we tell it to set a value. And this abstracts all that away as we're writing out these tests. So we can just say it's an edit box and set its value equal to, and we don't have to remember that, oh, it's set keys or anything like that. Now the support layer is code that doesn't correspond to the user actions. It's kind of almost the junk drawer of our automated testing. We've got our data classes here that contain our patients, our allergies. We've got builders that know how to build these out and filter them, get the information we need. And then there's a few generic things like taking screenshots and a few other utility functions like that live in the support. And then, so we've had a few challenges, but none of them have really been related specifically to this architecture and the tools. My cohort is on another continent, so our days don't overlap a lot. So that has given us some challenges in terms of making sure we're on the same page and talking through things and understanding each other. I've ran into some problems with our SQL servers, which Mac Ruby libraries don't like to talk to. Finally ended up doing ODBC with that, and so that seems to be working. I'm still having a problem getting non-ASCII characters out of my SQL Server database and sending them through Selenium. So if any of you have done anything with that with Selenium 2 and Ruby, please talk to me, because I want to figure out what I'm doing wrong. And I, just before the conference, ran into a problem. I was finding that my Ruby code, when I tried to run it and launch Firefox on my Windows machine, Firefox would come up and it would just hang, and Ruby would eventually get a timeout error. I tracked it down. The problem is the FortiClient VPN software. So if any of your IT departments make you install this, it apparently uses the same port that Selenium expects Firefox to use, and it'll make it just completely not work for you. So that's just a little aside. Where do I want to go with this? I already talked a little bit about the behavior manager. We'd also like to tie in some very basic performance testing. Originally, before I came here, I was thinking that it would just be timers wrapped around the scenarios. Having seen David and Shane and Mark's talks, I'm going to do it now with some of the extension methods that they talked about using that JavaScript. Fuzz testing, for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, is basically sending malformed input to an application and looking for things like buffer overflows, memory leaks. We should be able to do some very basic versions of that, again, with our test suite. Automated usability testing. Julian Hardy is here and had a paper in ACMQ, I don't know when it actually showed up. I saw it just a couple months ago, about ways that he's done automated testing of tab order and making sure that text renders in the space that's provided for it, and keyboard navigation. And I was actually talking to him this morning, and apparently he's got even more stuff up now at bettersoftwaretesting.com. So we're going to pull in some of that. One of the other pieces we want to do, our deployment teams actually go out to the hospitals, and because these are small hospitals, they may not even have their own IT department, so we're often sending people out to them to get things set up. And so we're going to package up our tests in such a way that they can run them there, make sure things are working correctly for the hospital. Random test runner stuff, and finally parallel execution. Some of the Selenium 2 grid stuff looked good, using continuous integration jobs. Pulling in some of that is something that we definitely want to do, but haven't had a chance to. So that's the end. I've been getting 5-minute and 2-minute warnings, so I probably don't have a lot of time for questions. Certainly you can email me. If you go on to the IRC Selenium channel, I'm Andy Tinkham there. You can find me there, and I'll be around for the rest of the conference. So.